Thank you, Jamie, very much. I really appreciate it. This is such a treat for me to be here tonight to introduce these two authors. I'm kind of in awe of them. I think they are both brilliant and amazing, and it's a delight to be able to introduce talent like this for my first inaugural event. So first, Elissa Schappell is a marvelous writer. She wrote this book, Blueprints for Building Better Girls, which I had the pleasure of reading in the last couple of weeks. The Boston Globe said about it that it's electrifyingly alive, funny, and thrillingly honest. And thrillingly honest was the two words that captured my attention. It made me uncomfortable at times to read this book. But it's so stimulating and exciting. It's a great read. She's also a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. She's a co-founder of Tin House, a literary magazine and publishing house with her partner, Rob Spillman. She's a former senior editor of the Paris Review, and she wrote another collection of stories that are interlinked like this book called Use Me, which was a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Prize. And she's terrific. If we just had one of these writers for you tonight, we would feel fortunate to have them both here together. I mean, our cup runneth over, I'm telling you. She has had the pleasure, I think, of publishing some of Karen Russell's work, which is kind of an interesting relationship that you two have. I can't wait to hear more about you both. This book, Vampires in the Lemon Grove, just came out this year. It's a marvelous collection of short stories. I've just read a couple of them. Consistently arresting, startling, profound, even more impressive than Russell's critically acclaimed novel, says the Kirkus Reviews, which Swamplandia, I think Swamplandia is going to become an American classic. It is brilliant, breathtaking writing. Coming from Florida, I felt like I was re-entering my childhood past that I didn't know I had, and I'm glad I don't know about it too much, but it's a wonderful read, very exhilarating. She also wrote a wonderful book called another collection of stories, St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves, which won the Bard Fiction for Prize in 2011. Swamplandia was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. So without further ado, I would like for us all to give a warm welcome to Elissa Schappell and Karen Russell.
Hi. Oh,
well,
my.
they promised us that would happen. We
we just hoped when we went to the loo we weren't mic'd.
Yeah. That would be our icebreaker.
Yes. That was such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And it's such a thrill, I think I speak for both of us, to be here. Not only because it's such a gorgeous place, but to be in a community that takes the arts so seriously and supports writers and all sorts of other artists. So
yeah, Elissa frequently can't just finish my sentences, but I mean, it's my first time in Aspen, and it's been a delight. And I was bragging to some of you that I discovered I'm a ski phenom this weekend when I went to Buttermilk and stood up in skis. Thank you. I know. I stuck it to the group of adult Peruvian men who kept falling. I was just riding high in the saddle on Buttermilk. And it's amazing to get to meet such serious readers. We both did visits to the schools today, different schools, and had a wonderful time.
Which was a big deal. You know what, that's a good way to start. Because Karen and I are good friends and talk a lot and very quickly and often finish each other's sentences, we were talking earlier about how do we contain ourselves. So we do have some notes here to contain ourselves. But that seems like a good place to start. Growing up, I grew up someplace where people weren't writers particularly. They were bankers or lawyers or chemical engineers. And going to the school today made me think about, like, when did I discover I was a writer? Yeah. And who was I reading that made me want to be a writer? I mean, did you always know you were a writer?
Oh no, but it's funny. I mean, this is actually, I think, a part of Elissa's history I don't know super well. It's a little embarrassing. I did always want to be a writer, but I certainly didn't know that it was possible to make a living writing fiction. I think I grew up in Miami, so Dave Barry was to me. I love Dave Barry. And so I would read, my favorite book when I was 10 was like Dave Barry Turns 40. I was like, it is so true what he says about balding and golf. I was like, amen, sir. And I was like, so maybe you could write a humor column. To me, that was like, journalism seemed like the lucrative way to, so, I did like the newspaper in high school and things like that, but I loved fiction always. And my ambition to be a writer sort of grew at pace with reading, exactly at pace. So when I was 6, I was writing these like doom stories.
Oh, yes.
All of which have the same, I never got any more sophisticated about plot. It's all like, once upon a time there was a valley of magical bears, new paragraph. Then there was a flood. So it was always, but that was, that is sort of the standard two-step. It's like a stable context and here comes a rock.
No, I was talking today to the students and talking about how when I was a girl, I discovered, I was reading comics and the books my parents gave me, so I was reading like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I remember my dad giving me Tom Wolfe, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. I had no idea. I was like 12. I was like, whoa, this sounds crazy. I can't wait to be an adult.
And when you're that age, every book is sci-fi. Yeah, I know. I read like Stephen King's like Dune, or I remember in 3rd grade reading In the Belly of the Beast, and it's just sort of a wash. Whatever, you have no real world reference point. So I would love to see some kind of cinematography of what a 9-year-old brain is doing with those words,
But I was also talking about how I read poetry, and I read Sylvia Plath, and so when the first thing I ever had published was a poem in my high school's journal. No, it's not exciting. I was kind of a secret writer. In my family, in my life, there were certain stories that were the acceptable stories. And I have a lovely family, wonderful family. But, there are just certain things you don't talk about. One does not talk about X or Y. And one thing we didn't talk about was you're never supposed to be sad. And so I had written this really, really sad, it's just ripping off Sylvia Plath terribly, poem. And
Were there crows in it?
Oh, there was crows, there was daddy, there was, God knows what else, sands of time. But I didn't sign, I wouldn't put my name on it. I said that it was anonymous. And when it came out in the school magazine, people were saying, oh, this is deep, this is so, smart. And I was like, I wrote that. And they're like, no, you didn't, Chappell. Be quiet.
Wow.
And after that, I was like, no, never again. But it did make me realize that there were certain things, certain stories that you could only tell behind that mask of fiction, which I think is a big deal. And there were certainly books that I was reading at that time that really, later on gave me that push.
Did you start out as a poet? Did you have secret poet ambitions?
No, I also found when my mother moved this whole shoebox of dirty haiku, no, not haiku, limericks. Horrible limericks. So no poetry, none of that. I was always a story writer. I was, wanting to rewrite history, I think, a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting about that. This is sort of an emotion you can't own in life, but somehow it does have this second life, or this place where you can see it, where it's manipulable. I can't even remember that we went to these schools today, and they were asking us, one of the questions I got were, what were your earliest stories like? And I don't even think in high school, I think it was just like a raw effusion of emotion.
Right.
I don't know if there was even a character to which that emotion was attached. It was just like feeling. And it wasn't until I got to college that I started to kind of think about narrative, as a way to process or a way to contain some of that.
But I find that I write for the same reason now that I wrote then, which was to figure out how I feel about things. Sometimes I don't even know what I think or what I feel until I write it down.
Yeah.
And also as a place to put all that emotion and stuff that you don't want to burden other people with, and to make some sense out of it. Also, if you're going to go through bad stuff, use it, right?
Yeah.
There's got to be some upside to it, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Make some lemonade, right? That's how I feel even now. I'm like, hopefully it'll all come out in the wash. Can I ask? So after Tom Wolfe,
yes,
and and just sort of whatever was on the bookshelf in your house, who were some of the folks that you're like, this is my literary grandma. This is my tree.
This is my tree. I really read everything. Where I grew up in Delaware, and I had a very standard, good public school education. And, so we read Faulkner, we read Fitzgerald, we read Hemingway. I didn't even realize really that women wrote books. I mean, I knew they did, but, like it was like Willa Cather and Flannery O'Connor. So it wasn't really till I got to college and started discovering people who are like my heroes now, like Lori Moore and Amy Hempel and Grace Paley, Toni Morrison. Those were the people who really set my brain on fire because they were writing stories that didn't necessarily have big plots, which was the other thing. I always thought, well, story must have a really clear plot.
It's a love story on a boat.
Oh, right, exactly.
During wartime.
And we have to have some car accidents. No, I was always much more interested in what was going on, and this is, I guess, my own narcissism, in my own head. I was always interested in what are people feeling, and, when people are feeling X or Y, what will they do, For me, story has always been what do characters do when all good sense tells them not to do it.
Yeah, it's funny for me, somebody that I read who was so good at exactly that sort of like the plausibly implausible, self-defeating behavior.
Right.
Just when the drama of the story is really like, why is this action deviating so frighteningly from your stated goal character, was Joy Williams, right?
Oh, right.
So, or just people, the huge gulf between, dialogue and then like this unspeakable.
Right. But you're so smart, and in all of your work, well, she is. There's all these references to, to mythology and all these classic literature and dead poets, all this stuff that I have to I go back, with an index and mark it all.
Oh.
Did you read a lot of that stuff when you were little? Were you reading like D'Aulaire's Greek myths? And that stuff?
I love like bullfinches. I did love mythology a ton. Or I still don't even know how to say this. I'm embarrassed to say this until I'm like Ovid or Ovid. That guy, Metamorphosis.
I don't know.
Guy.
Take a vote. Is it Ovid or Ovid?
I just fudge it. Well,
I always thought it was Ovid.
Today,
it makes you sound smarter.
Yeah, Ovid is. I know. I got corrected on NPR. I said I like Nabokov, and I guess it's Nabokov, but who knew?
I don't know. My teacher taught us that it was
Gross
knock
knew.
the book off. So
Yeah.
it's a public school education for you.
Well, you read the words. No, it's funny. My mom, I really credit a lot of like my whatever kind of style. You pick this up from the reading history of your youth sometimes. Like I'll read like Michael Chabon or even Junot Diaz. Junot Diaz and I, even though he is a Dominican man with like a profoundly different history and culture, we do like overlap in sci-fi nerd terms.
Right.
So I know and he'll sometimes read Dominican history through the lens of like Tolkien or Frank Herbert or even like Terry Brooks' short of Shannara series. And that's always like a weird, like a nerd shibboleth. I'm like, oh, he knows about the wind crystal or whatever.
Right.
So I wanted to read this sci-fi fantasy stuff. I think for me, part of it was just my own discomfort in my home and body. I was like, oh, New Jersey's still too close. Let's go to Dune, let's go to Middle Earth. Set the GPS for Middle Earth.
Middle Earth.
And my mom would say, you can read that stuff. She was really suspicious of it. I think because where they shelved it in our library, it was like in this weird ghetto near the beanbag chairs. It was like Dickens and
stay
like
away
the
from the
classics.
beanbag chairs.
And then if you like walked around to where it smelled weird and there were beanbag chairs, it was like sci-fi fantasy. And often those really were classic books and like exquisite literature, but they had also put like a sticker on them where it was like a cross-eyed dragon, like this just obese cross-eyed dragon. So I was like, oh, it must be kid stuff.
But but do you consider what you write fantasy? Because for me, there's, I think of you as being so much like George Saunders, that there's like the surrealist element, but it's all pulled together by these very recognizable human emotions and experiences.
Yeah, it's funny, right?
I never understand that when people say that.
I get the heebie-jeebies a little bit, but I mean, some of those books that I loved, it didn't seem so much weirder than, so my mom would say, okay, cool, get Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles,
right.
But you also have to read Jane Eyre. Okay, in the opening of Jane Eyre, that girl is locked in a red room with a ghost. I mean,
Yeah.
and it only gets weirder.
Right.
So I somehow think like those distinctions start to feel kind of false
Right.
to me sometimes. You're always like in this imaginary world. It's not like that's not some compressed, distorted
Right.
world. It's language on a page, So it's interesting. And I think with Saunders was someone who was this is George Saunders who's getting all this like warranted praise right now. But he's somebody who I think is fed by genre streams, all kinds of different streams.
Right.
And that's, to me, that feels so much truer about, just like what it's like to be alive. I think also it was sometimes easier for me as a kid, like to go, like Watership Down. I don't know if your kids read that book.
Oh, no.
Lots of, it's an epic saga. There's like a psychic bunny. All the rabbits have to like move from their warren to another warren.
It's
like
family,
the Odyssey with rabbits.
It's a family story.
Yeah, and it is. It's an epic, and it you can really consider how insane and dysfunctional human behavior looks from this estranged perspective.
But you can also get away with a lot by putting it behind that mask of like, oh, these are surreal stories. Oh, even if there is some human emotion, I think you can. Obviously, there is. You can get away with a lot.
Yeah. Well, even like folks like Grace Paley and Lori Moore, who I guess would be classed as realist female writers, and I know this happens to you too, where they're realist female writers because they're writing stories about women's interior
without
lives.
Wings. Yes, women without wings. Yeah. It's true. Right. But I think though that it's a little bit harder to hide if you are writing realist fiction, and especially in the first person. And all of you who are writers out here know this. If you write a story in the first person, everyone assumes, of course, that you are that. You are the protagonist.
We're so sorry that happened to you.
Oh, I know. It's like if all the things in this book happened to me, I would be dead. I would be, or at least locked up somewhere.
Like, how did your marriage survive all that?
Right. How many children
Poor
do you
Rob.
have? No, that was hard for my mother with the first book because the mother character in the first book becomes a big pot-smoking Buddhist. And so people would be like, oh, so is your mom still a drug addict? I'm like, is she still a Buddhist? I'm like, my mother is a Presbyterian who, like, white wine is like, that's as high as she goes. Being a WASP, you have to do that. That's just part of our creed.
I know. I think my own parents are still, like, a little resentful about. My first collection was called St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves,
Which is something that I used to get told all the time as a girl. Like, you look like you were raised by wolves.
Yeah. I mean, I still do, but it's not their fault, and they're human parents.
Right.
So that
exactly.
seemed like a tough rap for them.
It is. Definitely.
But I think it's interesting to think about sort of who influences you when you're kind of you're just receiving everything in like the matter-of-fact register of childhood, and then when you're sort of more consciously finding people like Lori Moore or George Saunders who open these doors.
Well, they can save you, too, because you don't feel so crazy. Also, I think so much of writing is about figuring out what your vision is, learning finding your voice, and also taking your material seriously. Like, I really didn't think when I started writing that anyone would want to read what I wrote because I wasn't writing about, going to sea, hunting whales. I'd never been in a war. Things like that. And then I started to figure out, like, oh no, well, a lot of these family stories are war stories, right? Like every story in some way is a war story. Yeah. And that to me was very liberating. You couldn't write, and I'm sure, I don't know how you feel about this, but like when I set out to write, I can't think about who might read it or what people's opinions will be of it. I just think of it as being like college radio. Like the only people that are paying attention to me are like my friends and family and a few people that are just passing through town.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, less so now. Yeah. Just some grifter who's like.
Some drifter.
A book.
I'll take the drifter. If the drifter pays top dollar, from an independent bookstore.
Under this Highlights magazine. Yeah. It's funny because I think, especially when I was a younger writer, I was so self-conscious. I was writing this sort of whacked out stuff, and I felt blessed because Dan Schoen, who's a fabulous story writer and novelist, came to our college. And I was writing this stuff about, like, I don't even know, psychic starfish and, like undersea dramas and this guy who painted landscapes on his teeth, like a Leona the Lobstar. I know, and everybody else I think was
And you
frightened.
really don't do drugs. I can't believe
I know, I
this.
don't at all.
Astonishes me.
It's already so fragile. Why rock the boat?
No. I'm not suggesting it's a good thing. I'm not suggesting it's a good thing at all.
But so Dan Schoen he had to read all of our submissions, and he was like, oh, dear. But what he did was, and Elissa has done this for me, too, by reading my stories. Like Another Human Mind, it's like a Pinocchio magic, where it's like, you're a real boy. Just another reader can give you that security or confidence. And he told me to read Kelly Link and Saunders and Kevin Brockmeyer.
Right.
Kelly Link is this fantastic writer who's writing. I've read them described as fairy tales for adults, which I always think is kind of a patronizing description of what she's doing.
Right.
She's like a fabulist. I was so clueless about kind of the kinds of stories I was writing, or I was just doing it intuitively, that when this collection came out, someone said, oh, you're a fabulist, and I said, thank you. I was just like,
I'd like to think I'm fabulous.
I'm pretty fabulous. Yeah. But I mean, they're fable-like, or she has one travels with the Snow Queen that's operating in a sort of Cinderella register. She does have women with wings, she has women who can fly, girl detectives who go to the underworld, but I felt like such a kinship with her, because even though the stories, I guess superficially you could say this is so crazy, this is so wild, it actually felt to me reading like a dream returning to my body, or some memory, some repressed memory that was pretty universal. They operated by their own logic, but they weren't insane, and
Right.
you could recognize the elliptical imagistic logic of these stories, and they were about the biggest questions. They're about, what do you do, the pain of being unknown by someone you love profoundly, being abandoned in an underworld,
Right. But these are all things that you write about.
yeah, which I felt like I had sort of been cycling, and like just trying to invent a language where I could talk about that honestly, because I think that's all. I just think every writer I know is just trying to invent a language where they can
Right.
come at something honestly.
Right.
And for me, it was like indirection. Sometimes the question would be so overwhelming, or the loss would be so huge that it could only be oblique, or it had to be shifted to this other register. That, I don't know, maybe there's a minotaur there, but this is a place where I can at last be honest about something that's sort of really monstrous about family life or
Right.
history.
Right.
So that was, it's lucky when people sort of introduce you, make these literary introductions to your kindreds.
Yes. I feel they become your art moms and dads, which is a big deal.
Is it a super segue to ask you to talk about origin story for Blueprints? Just kind of.
You mean where that all comes from?
Yeah, so how this particular book came together?
Well, I was fortunate enough to get a 2-book deal, and one of the things that they want you to do if you're a short story writer is write a novel.
Yeah. It's true.
And so I spent.
They're like, did you feel, I sort of felt like it was like if you like sang in the shower, like da-da-da-da, and they were like, that sounds good. Do it on stage.
Yes, exactly.
On 4
roller
hours.
skates, on roller skates. And
We're going to invite James Wood this time. And you're just like, oh.
That's what it was like. No, so I spent 2.5 years writing a book, a novel that I never really cared very much about, but I felt like I'm a good girl and I'm going to do my book report. And it was a big ideas book. I was like, this is Tom Wolfe. I'm going to be like Tom Wolfe, writing about racism and the relationship between women, upper and middle class women living on the Upper West Side of New York City, and their relationships with their Dominican and African American nannies, or no, not from the islands specifically, like Barbados. And I did it, and it was terrible.
I don't believe that.
No,
but-
every morning I woke up and I thought, oh my God, I have to write that book. I have to write that book. I never cared about it. And for me, the litmus test is always when I'm writing, if I feel slightly frightened, or if my heart beats fast, or if I think, oh, I shouldn't say that, that's where I should stay. That's like the hot spot for me, if I'm coming from someplace like that. And so I turned the book in, and my agent said, wow, this is amazing. None of the things that you do well are in evidence here. And I was like, well, all right then. But I've been married to the same man for 24 years, and so the only way that I can be promiscuous is on the page. So I'm not monogamous at all in my writing. And so while I was working on this terrible novel, I was also writing all these short stories. And I had just had a daughter, and I was thinking about the world in a very different way. And so I'd started to write these stories basically as a way to just figure out, what the hell am I doing? And to put that down. But they didn't feel legitimate to me because they were just these stories about these women. And that was a problem for me. And it wasn't until I had this voice of this one young woman in my head who is a big party girl in the book. She's a sorority girl who gets into all sorts of trouble, serious trouble. And she kept saying, why don't you write about me? Why don't you write about me? And I don't always hear voices. Stories do not always come to me in the voice of a character. I said that once to a shrink.
That's
and
like
he was
making lemonade too, right? I'm like,
Right.
Let's make this mild schizophrenia work for us.
That's right. That's right. Work in the direction of your strengths. And no, so she was saying, why don't you write about me? Why don't you write about me? And I said, well, I don't want to write about you because you're a ridiculous human being and you have nothing to say. And in that moment, I thought, you are such a hypocrite. Yeah. You're writing these stories about women's lives, writing about like what we don't know about women, and you're going to tell this young woman that her story doesn't matter? And I wrote her story, and that story is like what created the whole book for me. Because I thought, okay, I know what I'm doing now. All these people that we think we know, that we dismiss, I want to write their story. I want to tell you what you don't know about them. And the title comes from, I had a workshop with a woman who I admired, a writer who I admired so much, and I made the mistake of thinking, oh, well, she can save me, or she's going to love me. And big mistake. And she hated my work. I had just had a class with Amy Hempel, who was telling me how fabulous I was. And she hated my work. She said, you know, I don't know what's wrong with you, not like I've memorized the quote or anything. I don't know what's wrong with you new little ladies of fiction like Mary Gateskill. Why are you writing about these women who are having these terrible experiences and they're on drugs and they're drinking? Don't you realize that you have a moral responsibility to write stories that will provide blueprints for future generations of young women to live their lives?
Oh, no.
And I was like, I thought that all I had to do was be compelling and honest and, you know, hold the reader's attention and hopefully tell them something about the world they didn't know or didn't know they knew. And it destroyed me. And I wrote down everything that she was saying. And when it came time to title the book, I thought, Blueprints for Building Better Girls. It's like the absolute opposite of that. Like, you don't read this book and think this is the way you should raise your children, or you yourself should behave. But that's where it came from.
Do you think like Hunter S. Thompson got that lecture? They were like, what is this, Hunter?
Yeah, no, I'm
really
sure. No, I think it's
doing injury to the young men of America.
It's something that happens a lot more to women than to men, obviously.
But I love that title. I mean, that's the correct.
Well, what about you? Where did this book come from? What's its origin story?
Oh gosh, it's really similar. It's actually pretty similar, just in terms of like.
I don't know this answer. I'm so excited.
Recovering so it's really similar. So I had this story collection come out, and the line in publishing is that nobody reads stories. Let's change that, everyone. Evangelize your friends. But I mean, I love writing stories. That was the form that felt natural to me. But again, so there was one of them in this collection. Most of the stories in that first collection, I was really content to say "check, please" at the end. Like, we had a fun ride, but see you never again, Minotaur Dad. The end. And there was a story, Ava Russell's The Alligator, and of all the stories, I grew up in South Florida, so this was the landscape, sort of that most closely resembled my backyard in a way. It was this mythic Everglades. That to avoid like lawsuits and quibbly people telling me that I got like some fact wrong. But it was basically this family living in isolation in the Everglades, and their mother had died. That was kind of a surprise to me. I think I was so innocent about drafting at that time, and that first book was such a revelatory process because, I would think I was writing these really comic stories, and invariably they'd be about loss or death. Or when you were saying sort of uncomfortable things.
Right. Well, I want to talk to you about
humor,
worked
too,
at all, because they make me laugh.
Well, I think there's there's comedy and pathos. It's coevolution. But if the story worked at all, it was because it had turned on me and become something really messy and uncomfortable. So this particular story was like, alligator wrestlers. I want to write about alligator wrestlers because when I was a kid and growing up in South Florida. If you're a Florida kid, like your field trips are so cool. They're like, no more long division. Let's go.
You got to see alligators?
Yeah,
They took us to a prison and a Burger King. Every time I pass a Burger King, I'm like, yeah, I know how those Whoppers are broiled. I put a patty on there.
Wait, did they really? That was your field trip?
Yep. I'll tell you later.
Well, we went to see the Miccosukee Indian Village, where they sell you like wallets made in China, and you watch a kind of anticlimactic alligator wrestling, where like a sweaty man in a ponytail sits on a gator. I don't know, that stayed with me. I was 10. I was like, that's a strange profession.
Writer, alligator wrestler.
And so I think but all of Florida was that for me, was just like this kind of juxtaposition of something like totally beautiful. Like an alligator, I think, is so beautiful in a frightening, unfathomable, irreducibly mysterious way. And then you have also this ticky-tacky BS all around it, like Uncle Tommy Wally's like swamp buggy into like Dante's Inferno, like a sublime landscape. So just kind of that, I also think that in a way has influenced me as much as any book I've ever read. It's just growing up in South Florida. When people ask me about magical realism, I'm like, I don't know, go to South Florida. It's fantastic things are narrated in a natural register all the time, Yeah. Like the Publix is right next to the parrot jungle. They're like, how did these parrots get in the produce aisle, So this one story, it's about these two sisters it ended up being about so much more. I just thought it would be like a romp, or I don't know, like
Right.
just something really funny. And it's about this, ended up being about their park, Swamplandia, is in decay. Their mother is dead. The girls are genuinely haunted. One of them, who is sort of 16, I've read it described as like a sexual coming of age story, which also was news to me. I thought it was such a grief story. And this girl is sort of like monstrously possessed by a confusion of desires and believes she can talk to the dead, kind of conveniently in the wake of her mom's death. Anyway, this story freaked me out writing it, and doesn't resolve at all. They're sort of left on this weird precipice. You know, the older sister has just like jumped into a pond. She's like metamorphosing into something, you know, scaly and miraculous. The little sister is just watching this all go down, you know, sort of in the wall-eyed way of younger siblings. So, you know, a grand tradition of befuddlement. And you're like, what is happening to the big one?
Yeah.
And I just kept thinking about those girls. So for me, I think it was really that relationship. Like Elissa knows this, the greatest love I've ever known is like my sibling love,
Right.
uncomfortably for them. They're like, maybe you could write about another love.
Well, that's interesting. No, but you have those are two sisters and a brother in that
And that's
book.
just my template for family somehow. I mean, without ever, none of it, you know, I mean, it's emotionally autobiographical, I guess. Obviously, like I didn't come from wolf parents or alligator wrestling parents.
Right.
But, so it spread, that story. This is like the longest origin story. I'm so sorry, you guys. I mean, this is the rambling. This will shock you to learn that I couldn't tell that story in a linear way. It grew like kudzu. I had at some point like 50 pages, and I was like, oh, I'm a third of the way to a novel. I should spend money on credit cards and sell a novel.
Yeah.
And that was like in 2006, like years later when I was like, goddamn.
Polling. When
That
there
was
is no wind, row.
That was my honeymoon phase when I really
Now,
was like.
when the book came out, though, weren't you shocked to hear people call it a coming-of-age story? I
Yes.
mean, in that way that, you know,
Yeah.
it's like someone gets their period. Right?
Because I think it felt very limiting. I mean, it's also embarrassing sometimes, I think, to talk about your ambitions for a project, or I am starting to try to get used to that. Because for
you
a long
talk about
time,
your work before you do it?
Oh, no, but just even publicly.
Oh, I
because
won't do it at all, because if someone
Yeah.
doesn't do the right thing with their face, then I'm like, oh, it's a bad idea. I don't talk at all.
Right,
Maybe I'll
like,
tell you later after
Elissa,
more
I
white
just have a
sangria.
lazy eye. It's a great idea. Well, I mean, just now, even now, it's still sort of a tricky thing to talk about. I think when I often get the coming of age label, I think because my protagonists tend to be young women. Yeah, really young women,
Right.
sort of right at that threshold.
Right.
And I know you get this too. And I just think people, maybe we're wrong, but I always think it conjures sort of a Judy Blume, acne and periods kind of. I don't know, like that's.
Right.
And for me, it was. I really wanted this to be a much bigger story, sort of not even just about this one family, but sort of about South Florida generally. A lot of the mourning in the book, which is connected to their mother, I sort of saw as really an ecological kind of mourning. I grew up in Miami in the 80s when everyone's contending with development, you know, the sickening velocity of the change where we've like basically destroyed a millennial ecosystem in a couple generations.
Right.
So, and there's this great quote that I know that we both have stolen from Antonia Nelson about coming of age. Let me see if I botch it, you can jump in.
No, I'll try.
But she basically said all stories are coming of age stories when you think about it, because a character is confronted with a new event, some change in equilibrium, and they have to assimilate that, you know, or die. I mean, they have to assimilate that into their being. They have to come of age insofar as they're taking that into their worldview and their bodies and then moving beyond it. So, I mean, in this case, I was thinking about just grief, you know, just Dante's Inferno, right? Just moving through the hell of grieving for someone you've lost and trying to, some myth has been shattered and now you have to figure out how to tell a new story to accommodate this new reality. So it is, I guess, a coming of age, but it was familial and then also sort of, I just think even culturally, you know, so just that regionally, South Florida, trying to deal with what we've wrought, figure out a new story.
But I find that novel so it's so scary to me and full of menace, but it's also, I think, really funny. And I don't know how much people talk about the funny. And it's essential, I think.
Yeah, I get mad. I'm so grumpy. I'll get mad in either direction. If they're like, oh, it's a hilarious comedy, I'm like, no, it's a book about loss. Yeah, I would love to hear you talk about this. Elissa's like one of the funniest women I know. And just sort of how you, if you think of Blueprints as a coming of age story.
Don't set it up like that.
I know, it's not, I know, we just talk about tax accounting for the rest of our time.
That's right.
Yeah, I would love to know just both of those, sort of how you see the coming of age label as applying to this book in a way that's functional.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, and just thinking about the funny thing, there's a great Barthelme quote. I'm sure you all know Donald Barthelme, but when I read it the other night, I thought about you, where he says, if you want to do wacky, break their hearts. And I think that's what you do so beautifully, you know?
Yeah, but well, you know, folks that I love, sort of Calvino or Saunders or you, have this ability to kind of disarm and charm the reader. So you really, you let your guard down, you know? You're kind of lulled into a sense of security. You're laughing, right? You're open. And then I think, you're vulnerable.
Right.
I mean,
you
you're really
use
vulnerable.
it like using humor like or at least I like to have my characters often make jokes because they feel awkward or they feel angry or they simply can't say what they want to say. Yeah. So they make jokes, but oftentimes those jokes aren't terribly funny. My daughter's here somewhere, and there's one of my stories ends with a joke that's not funny at all, and it's not supposed to be funny, but she's still mad about that. It's like, that's not a funny joke, like, and it's like it's not supposed to be funny. But the idea is that, like, you can use humor as a way to
take
skewer
some crushingly sad material,
and that's when it's like
and
a
bring
shield.
it to someone's conscious attention. I mean, I think what I sort of love about laughter, just generally, is if people are laughing, it's a way that you can admit without the burden of saying, "Wow, look at that profound injustice." Right. Oh my God, you know, that's so horrible. If you can reveal that truth in a joke, right, where it's somehow it's safe, but it's not safe.
Right. But my favorite quote is Oscar Wilde saying, "If you want to tell people the truth, you must make them laugh, otherwise they will kill you." and it is true.
It's true.
I have had people, say to me, "Well, that story there's some parts in it that are very funny, but it's not, that's not appropriate. Like that's a joke. Someone has an abortion. That's not appropriate to joke about that." Or you're writing about someone. My first book has a lot to do with part about my father dying. And there's lots of jokes in there because that's how you get through it, right? It's like if you don't laugh, you die. Yeah. And in that case, I think laughter also provides a kind of catharsis, which I think is essential, like the best thing you can give a reader.
Yeah.
Even more than an orgasm. Catharsis is better.
I'll sign off on that. Yeah, or just, there's something about, laughing as a collective where it's an admission that we're all in agreement about something absurd that's just been shown to us. Right. Or there's I love, there are different kinds, right? I think there's the laughing to sort of smooth things over, nervous laughter, let's tamp the cowlick.
I'm very familiar with nervous laughter. Yes.
But then there's also just that shock, ice water shock of recognition when it's sort of oh God, it is that awful. And I think for me what's nice about it is to hear other people laughing, it's always sort of the antidote to loneliness. I mean, I was reading somewhere that Flannery O'Connor cracked herself up when she's writing.
Oh, she cracked herself
up?
up?
Yeah, it would just be
so mean.
She's so mean and so wickedly wonderfully funny. I mean, let's not go that route. That just seems like one step away from the loony bin. Yeah. If we're actually laughing out loud as we draft. No. But it's nice to imagine others laughing.
But I cry sometimes. I have cried a lot when I write. I've had to write in this recent book. Had to write about a couple who have been trying to have a child, and she has a miscarriage, and their relationship is not very good. They're both very lonely in their marriage, and they get a dog, and the dog becomes ill, and they have to put the dog to sleep. And I sobbed writing the end of that story when those people had to put that dog to sleep.
Yeah. I think that's a funny thing too. I know you get this a lot, right, from readers who are why do you do those mean things to your characters? As if you're this puppeteer of horrors.
It's not mean. It's it's people ask, yes, it's not mean. It happens all the time. It's sad.
Yeah.
It's really sad. And I'm not interested in writing really happy stories. Other people do that a lot better. I want to write about those moments where nothing is ever the same again. And I want to write stories that, yes, make people uncomfortable because there are a whole lot of people who feel uncomfortable in the world who read the same stories and say, "Thank you for writing that story. I didn't think anybody else felt that way." or I would never admit that I felt ambivalent about having a child, or I would never admit that I was lonely in my marriage.
Right.
And so that's why I write, in large part. Make the lonely people feel less lonely, and make those people who feel really comfortable in the universe a little less comfortable.
Yeah. Who are those smug
No. It's just like making the world expand, right? It's not about being punishing. It's just like make the world expand versus getting more narrow. And I think in my experience, not growing up reading a lot of women writers or knowing they even existed, it's really important to me to write those stories that aren't being told. Everybody knows, but nobody wants to talk about it or doesn't feel like they have permission to talk about it or wouldn't articulate it.
Well, that's one thing I love about Elissa's work, and that I think in a very different register I was thinking through in Swamplandia. In a way, I think this kid, Ava, who's the narrator, she's telling this pretty tragic story of the loss of her family, both to preserve her family. Like, if she can't actually save this park, Swamplandia, which would have been such a cop-out, right? She just can't. I mean, actually, the forces are not aligned. Like, one problem I have with underdog stories and the way that we love them in this culture is, you know, the flip side of that kind of individualism is like, well, we're never going to look at what we are complicit in, these like structural forces that create underdogs in the first place. Right. So, I mean, I don't want to spoil the book for people, but it's this kid who ends up having to tell the most painful parts of her own history to move beyond them. And just sort of like the way that a secret can turn lethal inside its host. Right. And I know that so many of your characters, that is a really, the power of disclosure, you know. She saves herself. Yeah, and that it requires sort of consciously telling the story instead of swallowing it. You know, there's another character, her sister, who is quite literally possessed by a ghost, possessed by a story, and really unconscious, you know, really, truly lost. And I think when people read that, you know, I don't know that people would necessarily see the kind of the parallels between a character like Osceola, this chick who falls for a ghost and is taken hostage by him on this like dredge machine.
Well, happily.
And Elissa's characters, so many of whom are sort of consumed by desires that are ungovernable, that the culture hasn't helped them to find a way to
maybe
talk
that's
about,
it's a
manage.
Desire thing. That's what we connect on.
Yeah.
Interesting. You know what? We've been talking a long time. Not surprisingly. Let's open
Jamie
it up.
to help us.
We'll take questions and answers now. We'll pass this around if anyone's interested.
Did we just talk at 60 miles per hour?
Yes.
I'm sorry, you guys.
They're all like, we have no idea what they said. They just seem really manic. And obviously, they should have had a couple cocktails before they have not completely sunk into the Aspen groove yet.
Hey, I got the mic.
Yes.
Was that loud? Hi. Hi, Bob. Hey, everybody. My name's Dan. Thank you, Karen, for that book. That was just great, and I was inspired in so many ways.
Thanks,
and there's so many things I'd like to ask you, but I'll narrow it down to a comment and a question. And the comment is, I laughed my ass off when Kiwi was in the final stage of his mainland experience. And I want to tell you, in the spirit of Dave Barry, that I think that a great name for a band would be the Nude Blue Fairies. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. You know what's one really obnoxious thing that I've been doing lately is hearing things that I either said or wrote and laughing. And I'm like, pretty great, self.
You knocked me off my chair with that one. That was good.
Just uniquely obnoxious.
And I was impressed on the prattle that went back and forth between the guys.
Oh, thank you.
And I am curious to know where the heck you got that.
Gosh, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. I have this like complete infatuation, obsession with adolescent boys. I think it is twofold. I think on the one hand, I feel like a shaggy boy myself much of the time. That's always an awkward question when people are like, why do you keep writing from the point of view of a young man? I'm like, let's call a therapist. Like,
it's a human. Let's think of them as being human.
Yeah, I think it's being human. And I think another huge one is that I am like really close to my brother. And my brother and his goon friends were always in our house. So then you just hear those rhythms, right? And it was such a different, I felt like Jane Goodall. I was like, listen to how they interact.
And now they're
So
using
different.
tools.
So different. I'm like, look at how they don't seem to want to bludgeon each other with words, but yet it keeps happening. I'm like, they love one another, yet hurt each other relentlessly with words. I'm like, they mock each other's genitals for, just So it was,
And
it
you're
was
taking
interesting.
field notes.
Yeah, I was like, oh wow, the power went out. They can't play their like lethal war games. What will they do? And I'm like, oh, they just are hitting each other in the face. Like they're just like filming one another lobbing vegetables from the crisper at Felipe. You know, it just. So thank you, but I credit my brother and his monkey friends.
That was hilarious.
How much do you rely on, I assume you have a writing community? Do you have a writer's group? At what point do you share what you're working on and with whom? Both of you.
It's just each other. We shun the others.
That's others. Shun, the shun.
We're big hypocrites. We ostracize all the others.
No,
And
it's
you take
hard.
it.
It's really, it's hard because I do think you have to figure out, and any of you who write know this, you have to figure out who will be good readers for you, who will understand what you're trying to do and help you figure out how to do it, how to write the story in your way, not rewrite it the way that they would like to write it. You absolutely need community. The problem, though, I think, is that our community can also be fiercely competitive. But I don't show to very many people. I used to do it a lot, and I made the big mistake of showing it to my family, and I've really come to learn that you have to protect your stories from your family, but you also have to protect your family from your stories. So until things really, if anything is based at all on people that I know or experiences that I've had, I really have to work it over, 10 drafts so that no one is recognizable anymore, because it's not fair. But I do have a few people that I show to. One friend who's really great on the line, who will just go through and say, this is, cut all this, move this line makes no sense. Will just help me throw everything out. Another one who seems to know my better self, who's smarter than me and can channel a better me, and will say, I think this is what you mean here. And that's really helpful. But it's also incredible to have someone like Karen in my life who can read my work on a level that I don't see it, and be really really helpful when people are mean to you, because people are mean to you.
Yeah, no, in a wordless way, I think that's so true, to know someone's got your back.
Yeah.
Because it's really actually quite exposing and tough. I know that always, that if some, we were talking about that last night, if Sheffield 47 on the internet is just sucks with 1,000 X's. I know Elissa, the internal voice of Elissa will tell me I don't need to listen to Sheffield 46.
No, don't read any of those reviews.
I know.
None of them. Anyone that has time to write reviews on Amazon isn't writing or doing anything worth doing. So why would you listen to their opinion anyway?
Because my impulse is always to be oh, Sheffield 46 has my number.
No, stop it.
But I mean,
No.
it's getting harder. I used to show to people from graduate school.
Right.
And sort of the numbers dwindle. It's a lot to ask of somebody, and everyone's kind of busy with their lives.
Right.
So, and I think it can be damaging to show something that's too soon, something in utero.
Right.
I've made that mistake where I'm oh, that was actually too soon to show somebody.
Right.
Not that their feedback isn't well-intentioned or even really intelligent, but sometimes it's not done becoming
it's
itself.
when people ask you about baby names. You shouldn't tell people what baby names you're thinking of, because they're going to tell you they're terrible. Right? You introduce them.
Yeah.
This is Octavia.
You're like,
and
Jawanda's
everyone's
arrived.
well, there's Octavia. No, I think it's hard, and I think it does need. It feels like it needs to be in its own little bubble. It needs to be its own thing. It has to take on its own weight.
Yeah.
And so you love it and you want to protect it.
Yeah, but I think that's key. I do have just a few people who I think are really smart readers and can say with total generosity, they'll do Jim Shepard, actually. I haven't shown him anything for a long time, but he is the best. And he'll do this magic where it's an ultrasound of your own best intentions. The story isn't there yet, but it's you're oh, it's something that does not resemble what you've made. It's sort of what it could be.
Right, but I think that's a gift.
Which is a gift, yeah.
I studied with Allen Ginsberg for a semester, and he used to talk about how important it is to read. He would read his work through the lenses of different friends of his. He said, I read my work through the eyes of Corso, and I say I could be more emotional here. I could be more naked here. I read through the eyes of Burroughs here. I'm being too self-indulgent. And I think a lot of what I do now is I think of who are my teachers and who are people that I admire, and try and read it through their eyes.
Yeah.
which I think is a very useful thing to do.
Sort of follow-up question to that. How do you know when your work is like baked, done, finished? Because if you're sort of working it from those different lenses.
It's hard.
It is hard. Thank you for follow-up synonyms for baked. It's always that way. It's always like stoner's paradise.
Especially in Colorado.
Right? Yeah.
Isn't there's that line that no book is finished, it's only abandoned. You can continue to work on it and work on it and work on it, but I think what happens is it then becomes something different. That you can't step in the same river twice.
Yeah.
You write it has to be its thing, and if you do it too long, it loses that
Urgency.
that juice,
Yeah.
that urgency.
It's funny because I was just not complaining, but I was telling Elissa there's
Certainly not
a writer dude that I know who's like, this is the best thing I've ever written. I just think it's the best thing. But he says that about everything. I'm like, what would that be like? To just like high five yourself, like and just hit the period and.
But don't you think though, but on like a true craft level, I always think something is done when there's nothing you can take out, right? Not when there's nothing else to put in, but when there's nothing you can take out. And I find that I can figure that out when I start to read it out loud. I will often find that the first page of a story can go because a lot of it's throat clearing. It's like I'm learning the story, I'm getting into it. I'm almost seducing myself so I forget that I'm even writing it. So if I take off the first page and I take off the last page, where invariably I'm trying to tell you what I hope I've already shown you,
Right.
it's better.
Right.
And whatever I'm reading, if I want to skip a part, I know it has to go. I'm embarrassed by it. The writing is flabby. It doesn't belong there. But it's a really hard thing to do sometimes to know what can go, especially if you've been working on it for a long time. And that's where having a really good reader who's also a good editor can help. But it's hard to know. And with everything I've ever had to let go of, it's always been like, you need to turn your book in now because you have to get on an airplane, in 2 hours. So you need to do that.
You have
Deadlines.
to let it go. It's funny.
It's very hard.
With this book, and I'm sure that there are things that could be different about it, but it was I struggled with it for so long. And there's sort of so many different worlds that I was trying to juggle that I got to like a Jenga place where I just felt like, okay, maybe one piece is sticking out a little weird, but I'm not even going to touch it. Like at last, I just felt like there was some kind of equilibrium, and I had gotten to the ending that felt like the most genuinely happy ending I could land on for this particular family, where it felt like opening. It didn't feel like anything was really shut down, but for me, it felt like the right resolution. So but beyond that
Did you know it when you wrote it, though? When you got to that place?
In like the first draft, that was the best feeling. That when I got to sort of through an ending, and actually I kind of felt like the real ending, or like where I was like, okay, now there's a scene where she sort of is in discussion, in dialogue with her mother, not like a ghost, like a Bill Cosby ghost, dad ghost, but just in dialogue with the spirit of her mother. And that is kind of the buoyancy that saves her. And that felt like the correct.
Because I do think sometimes you get gifts like that. I knew the last line of my book, even though it wasn't what I was writing towards.
Yeah.
I just thought, the last line is, there's no such thing as just a girl. And I was like, that's the last line. I wasn't anywhere near done with the book.
Right. But that is such a gift, right? Because then it's pleasurable to move forward.
But then you think, the universe, you're not against me.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank
or
you.
Or
Thank
it's less
you for
like
the
you're
gift.
going to be spelunking in the dark forever. You're like, hello? Is there a bottom?
Yeah.
Maybe we can do one last question.
This is so nice you ask questions.
I know. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for letting us talk at downhill speeds.
This question is for both of you because you're women and you seem to write a lot about what it's like to be a woman. And it's a personal question because I have two very young children. But how do you feel? I know that, Elissa, you have children. After you had children, did your art or did your writing change? If so, how?
I became a lot more ferocious after I had children, which I was not expecting at all. I really felt, I've always worked, and everybody I knew worked, but it was really important to me for my kids to see me work and to show them that, if you're an artist, you work, and women work. And I really wanted to write books that felt important. And I also felt like I don't have a whole lot of time necessarily. And when you're a parent, you have to really compartmentalize your life. So in some ways, it made me a lot more serious because I knew I was going to work from 8 until 2:30. It's going to take the kids to school, and then I was going to pick them up, or my husband would. And in that time, I was going to write, and that was sacred time. And after that, I was going to be I was going to do all mom stuff. I found if I didn't really set up a really clear schedule for myself, then I had like this creeping resentment and dissatisfaction. It's like I didn't get to write today, and I should be writing. And then I would feel guilty that when I was with my kids, that I was thinking about writing. So, it became this cycle. So it was really good for me in that way, that it really made me take myself very seriously and my work very seriously and set up a real schedule, by which I can do it. I just feel like I pay a lot more attention now that I'm a mother, and I really don't. I think I used to care a lot more about what people think. Maybe I didn't love, I don't know, I love them. I care what they think. Everybody else, my mother, you. But I think it made me a lot tougher. I don't put up with the bullshit I used to put up with. So I think that being a mother has been great for me. I'm not scared of stuff like I used to be.
That's great. I love that. No, I was just thinking actually about just a hip hop song where that's the basic sentiment, even though it's voiced
Well, me
by...
and hip hop, we have a lot of crossover.
Yeah, it's for your crew, your family, your friends.
My crew, yeah. But I didn't feel that way before. I was a lot less stable in my work habits and feelings.
All right. I think that's it, everybody. Karen and Elissa will be in the lobby, and you can ask more questions there if you have more. Thank you very much for coming.